Ukraine can win the war. In February 2022, Russia began their assault on Kiev. In a matter of days, Russia would advance throughout Ukraine, looking to topple the Western-backed government in Kiev while also seizing areas of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, Sumy, and Kharkiv. The most concerning advance, however, was the one moving south from Belarus, directly towards Kiev. Many analysts predicted a swift defeat of the Ukrainian military, and offers were made to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to flee safely outside the country. Zelenskyy stayed, and Ukraine managed to hold firm through the initial days and weeks of the war. Now, Ukraine has a real chance to win the war. Zelenskyy, a man who has already cemented his legend in Ukrainian history, has a chance to undo the damage wrought on Ukraine after the Maidan Revolution. That said, hard choices lie ahead. Zelenskyy was an unlikely choice to be the new Ukrainian president in 2019. A comedian and actor, Zelenskyy would star in the popular show Servant of the People from 2015 to 2019, in which Zelenskyy would serve as, ironically, the Ukrainian president. In the show, Zelenskyy plays a high school teacher who goes viral while ranting about corruption in the government, and then ultimately becomes president of Ukraine to fight that very corruption. Life would imitate art in this case, and Zelenskyy would run for president of Ukraine on the same platform as he did in the show in 2019. He would win, though the corruption that wrought Ukraine would be much less easy to root out than in the show. In fact, Zelenskyy himself would be implicated in the Pandora Papers when it was found that he had owned a stake in an offshore shell company. This controversy, as well as other inconsistencies throughout the early years of his presidency, would undermine the image he wished to present. Still, Zelenskyy continued on as president. With the primary goals of rooting out corruption, he also had a considerable challenge that had plagued Ukraine. Russia occupied parts of the country. Zelenskyy, already with his hands full dealing with restoring Ukraine's image to the world by rooting out corruption and restoring the justice system, would also have to continue the work of his predecessors to restore the Ukrainian military to a state that could combat their adversary. One of the primary goals of his presidency was to end the war with Russia. He would attempt to do this in earnest throughout 2019 by speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin on entering into ceasefire talks. While attempting to do this, he would also meet with far-right militias in eastern Ukraine and attempt to gain their support for peace talks and get the groups to surrender their weapons to Ukraine. Both of these attempts ultimately would fail. That following year, Russia would begin building up its military presence along the border with Ukraine. Zelenskyy, realizing negotiations were not likely to succeed and seeing the behavior of Russia, would appeal to NATO to allow Ukraine into the alliance quickly. NATO, while being a defensive alliance, contains a clause that forbids the acceptance of new states that have ongoing conflicts. NATO wasn't coming, and Ukraine was on their own. As Russia would continue to array forces along the border with Ukraine, Zelenskyy would turn to European countries and the US and Canada for military assistance. His attempts at peace having ended in failure, he had to gain some amount of outside support in order for Ukraine to survive as a state. While no support would arrive in time, Zelenskyy declared a mobilization of Ukraine and began preparing for war. Still, Zelenskyy appealed to Russians to prevent war from happening. On February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion, and Zelenskyy would respond to Putin's order with an emotional plea to Russians to prevent the war. Throughout the next several days, attempts were made on Zelenskyy's life, and after weeks of fierce fighting around Kiev and even around the presidential complex, the Russians were repulsed. Ukraine, proving the analysts wrong, was fighting back. Aid would begin to flow in from the west, and Ukraine would manage to use that aid not only to stop the Russian advance, but to push the Russians back. Putin would be forced to double down by announcing a partial mobilization of Russia, and while the battlefield would change dramatically over the course of several months, Zelenskyy would go from having an image of a corrupt and weak leader to a hero of freedom and defender of Europe. Still though, a lot of fighting remains, and while Ukraine has pushed Russia back, they still have a long way to go. Zelenskyy has challenging decisions ahead of him, but he can now see the light at the end of the tunnel. He not only has a chance to make good on his election promises to end the war with Russia, he can end it with a Ukrainian victory. A costly and devastating victory, but one where Ukraine is able to reclaim the territory it lost in 2014. One of the first things Zelenskyy needs to do is assess what the Russians are planning to do. The Russian mobilization has brought a significant amount of personnel to the front lines for Russia. This has helped Russia with one of their biggest liabilities since the outset of the war, and has helped them to slow the advance of Ukrainian forces after embarrassing defeats in Kharkiv and Kherson. Zelenskyy's military leadership could assist him by presenting him with two different predictions for what Russia will do in the near future based on their current capabilities and intentions. One would predict the most likely likely course of action, and the other would predict the most dangerous course of action. This would be backed up with intelligence assessments. The most likely course of action would likely show the Russians continuing to reinforce their front lines with mobilized troops to put a stop to the Ukrainian advances in Luhansk between Kreminna and Svatova. They would also continue to make offensive gains on Bakhmut and outside Donetsk city, both of which have been extremely costly for both Russia and Ukraine. With the winter setting in, it may not be likely that Russia would attempt any major offensives, instead opting simply to stabilize the front line and refit their forces for renewed fighting in the springtime as the weather warms back up. This could be what the most likely course of action would look like when presented to Zelenskyy, but it may be considered optimistic when compared to the other prediction he receives, the most deadly course of action. In this scenario, bolstered by large numbers of mobilized troops in an attempt to exploit the cold and terrible conditions, and desperate for gains not only to relieve the political situation but also the military situation, Russia may launch another offensive. While at the start of the war, Russia would fail to take Kiev, they would opt instead to focus on fighting in south and eastern Ukraine. Under this scenario though, Russia may attempt another attack on Kiev. As this is the most deadly, a new attack on Kiev may even include elements of the Belarusian army, whether in an attack alongside Russian forces on Kiev or in a separate attack further in the west toward the city of Lviv, attempting to cut Ukraine off from Western military support. While assaulting Kiev and possibly Lviv from the north, Russia may also attempt to pin Ukrainian forces currently in the south and east by launching fresh assaults throughout Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, as well as potentially Kharkiv and Sumy. In essence, Russia would use their mobilized troops to attempt a second run of their earlier assault on Ukraine in hopes of better results due to Ukraine's degraded state. While these two reports may disturb Zelenskyy, they may also present him with an opportunity. Regardless of what Russia chooses to do, they are currently less capable of launching a successful offensive than what they were at the start of the war. Even if the most dangerous course of action comes to pass, Zelenskyy could order his military to simply suspend offensive actions until the attacking Russian forces are retreated to the point where they are no longer combat capable. This degrading of capability on the Russian military opens fresh opportunities for counteroffensives by Ukraine. Those opportunities may even show themselves along multiple parts of the extensive front line. There are two examples of what this has looked like previously in this conflict, and yet they come with two previous Ukrainian counteroffensives, Kharkiv and Kherson. In Kharkiv, the Ukrainians were able to exploit the gap in personnel that the Russians had left to defend the area. This was because Ukraine broadcasted their desire to retake Kherson in the south, leaving Russia to pivot some forces from Kharkiv towards the south to reinforce this pocket. When Ukraine finally attacked, they attacked both Kherson and Kharkiv simultaneously. Because they outmatched the Russian personnel in Kharkiv, they were able to force an unorganized retreat back for the Russians, capturing large swaths of territory and threatening Russian-occupied Luhansk. A different story played out in Kherson, though, as Ukraine didn't enjoy the same overmatch in personnel as they did in Kharkiv. Instead, the fight would move much slower, with attritional warfare breaking out along the front line. However, after a series of long-range precision strikes challenged Russian logistics and made the Russian position untenable against Ukrainian pressure, the Russians fell back across the Dnieper River. Zelenskyy, seeing these two styles of counteroffensives, knows he doesn't have to achieve rapid success for a counteroffensive to work. Attritional warfare can fit into the plan if the Russians have similar force strength. This style can be used on places that are much harder to fight in and capture, like Crimea. During the Kherson offensive, there were concerns that Ukraine would have to fight Russia inside Kherson city proper in street-to-street fighting. The battles of Bakhmut and Severodonetsk have shown how costly a prolonged fight against a dug-in defender can be in an urban environment. Instead of having to fight in Kherson city, Ukraine simply strangled the Russian forces in and around the city by targeting their logistics chain. The destruction of bridges, threatening of pontoons, and work of sappers made resupplying Russian troops costly and time-consuming, which complicated the position of the Russian troops actively fighting and in need of resupply. Zelenskyy knows that the same theory can be applied to a province like Crimea, where Russian logistics can be challenged in a similar fashion with attacks on the Kerch Strait Bridge, targeting of naval vessels, and the threatening of the land bridge in Zaporizhia with indirect or even direct fire. In preventing Russia from resupplying Crimea, Ukraine would simply need to outlast them without the need for direct fighting or attempting to land an assault on Crimea. Zelenskyy is familiar with the history of this peninsula. He knows that in many ways it acts as Russia's center of gravity for this conflict, going back to the Orange Revolution and Yushchenko's threatening to expel the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol. Losing the port of Sevastopol would have strategic level consequences for Russia, who, due to geography, does not enjoy easy access access to the Atlantic Ocean during wintertime except through the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean Sea. That access can be made much more complicated if Ukraine can contest or outright deny the use of Sevastopol or even the whole of Crimea. Zelenskyy knows that this could bring escalatory consequences for Ukraine. However, this is a risk that Zelenskyy knows he needs to take into account moving forward. He's heard the rhetoric coming from Moscow, and while he believes that it's just a scare tactic, he knows that Russia possesses the capability as well as the desperation to use everything at their disposal to simply not lose. This will all come to significant cost to Ukraine even without escalation by Russia, a fact which Zelenskyy knows better than anyone. While figures on Ukrainian losses are difficult to validate, some estimates show that Ukraine has lost around as many troops as Russia has. While losses are high, this ultimately comes down to whichever side has the greatest will to win. Zelenskyy is leading his country in a fight for independence and sovereignty against an opponent fighting for imperial ambition. While Vladimir Putin can say he's willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of troops to achieve his goals, Zelenskyy is willing to sacrifice everything, including himself, to maintain Ukraine as an independent state. Ukraine can win this war because Ukraine needs to win this war, more than Russia needs to win this war, and Putin's regime is likely hanging in the balance over the result of this conflict. All of this informs Zelenskyy that no matter how intense fighting gets, and no matter how many towns are liberated, the fighting is likely to last for a lot longer than anyone thinks. Unless he's able to score a massive victory and Russian forces begin to fall apart and retreat across the Russian border on all fronts, Ukraine is going to have to fight them off. The cost of this, while firmly on Putin's hands, will be dear. Ukraine can win the war, and Zelenskyy knows it. It will just take time and cost both Ukraine and Russia dearly.